Configure DNS Records. Hey everyone, Ben Finkel here, and the objective for this nugget is to learn about the various domain name system DNS records that we need to configure in our DNS host in order to properly route traffic from the wider public internet into our Office 365 tenant. We'll talk specifically about what those DNS records are and what services they enable, why we need them, and then we'll jump into the admin interface and we'll see exactly how we set them up and how we can configure them in a couple of different ways that makes it pretty easy on us. DNS, domain name system, can get really complicated really quick. As simple as it is, it can quickly grow and evolve into something more complex, and it can really confuse a lot of professional IT administrators. I know I sort of groan inwardly every time I've got to work with DNS. But for this nugget, we are not going to get complicated. We're going to keep it really simple by remembering one simple fact. Domain name system is just the phone book of the internet. What do you do in a phone book? You translate a person's name into a phone number. It's occurring to me right now that I may have some listeners who are too young to recall phone books. But you know what? In your phone, you've got your contact list. Same idea. You've got a contact by name, and in there is stored their phone number. And the reason for that is because it's easy for us as people to remember names and to remember text and to remember words. But it's not so easy for us to remember numbers. Numbers are a lot harder. But of course, the entire internet communicates with numbers, not with names. So when a user comes and sits down at their computer and they want to, let's say, send an email off to you, and your email address happens to be joe@cbtoffice.com. Well, cbtoffice.com is meaningless to the internet. The very first thing it has to do is it's got to translate cbtoffice.com into an IP address. It's got to look up cbtoffice.com and find out what the IP address for that domain name should be, and then it can send that on to the Exchange server. It can find the Exchange server on the internet with that IP address. Same thing if we're talking about SharePoint Online. If you want to get to a SharePoint site, well, we punch in, cbtnuggets2016.sharepoint.com. That's a text. That's a piece of text, and it needs to be looked up inside of a domain name system in order to get translated into the correct IP address where the SharePoint Online server is stored. So when we talk about DNS, all we're talking about is translating text into numbers, looking up a name in the phone book, getting the associated number. So when it comes to Office 365, we need to set up DNS records in the global public internet phone book in order to facilitate communication from outside sources into our Office 365 tenant. Just like that joe@cbtoffice.com example that I just used, if we want emails, if we want the internet to know how to route emails into us at Office 365, well, that lookup has got to be created inside of the domain name system. And there's two basic ways that you can do this. The first way is the way that we did inside of our custom domain nugget. If you haven't watched that custom domain nugget, go ahead and watch that right now, get caught up on how we set that up. Because basically what we did there is we turned over responsibility from our DNS host, our domain registrar, over into Office 365. We changed the name servers that it used to Office name servers, Microsoft name servers. And then we let Office 365 automatically set up all of the records that we need, all the DNS records that we need. It sets them up and maintains them automatically for them. So that makes it really easy, simple to do, right? If we look at the pros and cons of doing things this way, it's really easy, it's mistake-free. There's a lot of records, as you'll see in a minute. You could easily kind of fat finger or screw up some of the intricate details of setting up these records. And if there's any changes or updates, that's going to happen automatically. We don't need to go in and constantly update and maintain the DNS records. Now, it has a few cons, and those are mostly through flexibility. All email, in this case, has got to go through Office 365. Once you are forwarding all email to cbtoffice.com, well, anyone who emails someone at cbtoffice.com, Office 365 has got to be set up to handle those emails. Even if it's going to forward them on to another email server somewhere, Office 365 has got to be prepared for that. Also, any web traffic has got to be redirected from Office 365. So if you've got a website sitting at cbtoffice.com, well, that's not hosted in Office 365, so Office 365 has got to handle and redirect web traffic over to that website. Now, the alternative to doing this, of course, is to manage these DNS records yourself. In this instance, you set up all the DNS records yourself inside of your DNS host or your domain registrar, whether that's GoDaddy, NetSolutions, 1&1. There's a whole bunch of different registrars that you might use. And in that case, all of this is managed and maintained by you, and it handles redirecting the appropriate traffic over to your Office 365 tenant when that traffic hits the public internet. The pros for this, well, it's really flexible. You can handle your email and your website hosting appropriately. You can get a lot of power and flexibility in your DNS system by using your own registrar, your own DNS host, The cons, of course, manual setup is error prone, and your host may not support this. Setting up your name server to point over to Office 365 is not necessarily supported by your domain host, though these days it pretty much is. So your two options, Office 365 manages it or you manage it. We already covered this option in our custom domain nugget, so we're going to take a look at how we can manage or what records we need to set up when we manage DNS ourselves. Now, if you don't get anything else out of this nugget, I want you to stop right now, take a screenshot of these entries right here, and, well, pretty much memorize them. This is the kind of information that you might run into on the test, on the 70-346 exam, and it's really important to get these down. There's three different products that we need to set up DNS records for, and that is Skype for Business, Exchange Online, and SharePoint Online. And these are the DNS records, the types and the details that are required for each one of these. So for Skype for Business, you need to go into your DNS host and you need to set up these two SRV records. Notice one is pointing to SIPDIR and the other to SIPFED. They're slightly different. One is TLS and runs on port 443. The other is TCP and runs on port 5061. You also need two CNAME records here, Link Discover and SIP, pointing to these domains here. For Exchange Online, you need an MX record, a TXT record, and a CNAME record, and those are relatively straightforward. The only detail that you got to worry about here is your domain token. That's going to be domain specific, and typically it's just going to be domain dash com, org, whatever the end of your domain is. So in my case, it would be cbtoffice-com. But you do need to look that up in your Office 365 Admin Center in order to get the specific value that's going to go there. Lastly, SharePoint Online. If you're using SharePoint Online with email, you need to replace this TXT record with this one right here. So you need to slightly change that TXT record when you're using SharePoint Online. Now this looks like a lot. Obviously this is complicated. Like we talked about a moment ago, you can always let Office 365 manage this. You don't have to worry about the complication at all. But I'm going to show you right now a really easy way to get this information so that you can set it up on your registrar. To do that, I've switched over to my web browser and logged into office.com, and I'm going to bring up the admin panel. And we can find all of this information right where we set up our custom domains. So on the left-hand navigation panel, once it finishes loading, I'm going to expand Settings and choose the Domains tab here. And here are my different domains. If we choose cbtoffice.com, here's all my required DNS settings. When you come in, it may all be shrunk up like this. You just need to click it to expand it. And I can actually see all of the records that need to be set in order for my domain to run. So you can expand and shrink any of these right here. So for instance, here's the Skype for Business, the two CNAME records and the two SRV records. Here is my Exchange Online, my MX TXT and CNAME record. Notice I've got the TXT set to spf.protection.outlook.com, so I'm not using the email with SharePoint Online, so I don't have that that SharePoint Online TXT record going on here. So there's other DNS records here that it uses to configure and route traffic internally. DNS records that you don't need to worry about, but again, it's nice. They're already set up for us because when we set up cbtoffice.com, we chose to let Office 365 host our domain. If I come here to DNS management, it's going to bring up a little wizard page. And one of the things that I can do is I can say I'll manage my own DNS records. I can just check this right here. Click Next, and the next thing that it's going to do is it's going to try to figure out where my name server, where my host is. Now, because I already changed off my NetSolutions domain registrar to point to Office 365, it's recognizing that my name server is actually hosted in Office 365. I'm going to go change that right now, though. So I'm here at networksolutions.com. I've logged in and accessed my cbtoffice.com domain name. Depending on who your registrar is, these things are going to look a little bit different. GoDaddy looks different than 101, which looks different than Network Solutions. So whoever you happen to be using, the functionality doesn't change, but how it's looked, how it's laid out on screen is going to change. And you can see my domain name servers are all pointed to microsoftonline.com domain servers. If I click Edit here, then I can change these back to the original, what they were. And they tell me right now they were ns1.networksolutions.com. So I'm actually going to do that. So here I've updated my domain name servers to two public domain name services that are out on the internet. So now that that's done, I can continue. And if I wanted to, I can edit advanced DNS records over here. Skip this offer. I'm not interested in that. And here's where I can set up my A records, my MX records, my CNAME records. So I could build all of those records that I needed in order for traffic and communication to properly reach my Office 365 tenant from the outside public internet. So we come back here to our Office 365 Admin Center. I can already see cbtoffice.com has got possible service issues. If I click that and say DNS errors detected, click here to view, yeah, it's recognizing that my DNS server no longer has the appropriate records for me. So when it comes to administering this stuff, Office 365 is going to be really great about telling you what DNS records you need, what you need to create on your DNS host in order to get proper service. But when it comes to the exam, you kind of just got to know these things, remember them, and be able to answer questions about them. For my money, I'd rather just leave the name servers hosted in Office 365 and not have to worry about setting up those records myself. So that concludes this nugget on configuring DNS records for Office 365. To recap, you got to set up DNS records in order to enable traffic from outside from the public internet to properly get routed to and reach your Office 365 tenant. This is going to be especially important for SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, and Skype for Business, formerly known as Lync. Microsoft can handle setting up these DNS records for you by hosting them internally in Office 365, or it will tell you exactly what to key in on your own DNS host if you're going to use your own DNS host. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.